So, the idea of a 9 to 5 office was based really more on tradition than it was on efficiency or employee well-being. So like I said, to set the context, let's talk about that. So I've got some stats here I'm going to quote. So the 8-hour in-office workday, has some very old and interesting beginnings. Robert Owens, back in 1817, came up with the expression 8 hours labour, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. He was a Welsh Labour leader, but the idea didn't really stick or take hold until 1926, when Henry Ford mandated the 40-hour 5-day work week. Now, look, he did that for obvious reasons, to boost productivity, to boost profits, like you'd expect. So, but what the point from that is, realistically, the idea of 8 hours in the office was developed for a highly manual labour force, right? That required your physical presence to be there. These days, the only real requirement for that is a good enough Wi-Fi connection, and the ability to join a Zoom call. Not that that's easy sometimes, but the reason why people are in an office has changed, and our ability and the ability to join through digital media, through digital mediums, things like Zoom, things like Google Meet, things like Skype, is so much easier and is so accessible to the majority of people that were working those office hours, that it now seems like we've long passed that point where remote working is not just possible, but it's the better option for a lot of people. But look, don't take my word for it. I do have some stats here. So when we look at the remote working, it's not this sudden thing that's just happened because of COVID, right? There's a study done by the global workplace analytics.com website, and they looked at regular work at home people among the non-self-employed population, and they found that there's been an increase in people working from home of 173% since 2005. So this is pre-COVID. That's 11% faster than the rest of the workforce. So remote work is also an increasingly desirable trait for, this is an important thing for recruiters to understand. Remote work is an increasingly desirable trait an employer can offer, with 57% in this study saying that the option to work remotely is their most preferable employment perk. Their most preferable. So, think about that, 57%. And this study, again, was done pre-COVID. So these are the kinds of stats that we really need to be considering when we start looking at how recruitment trends will be changed by remote working. So there was another study by Gartner that was published this month that said that 74% of CFOs said they will be moving more workers to permanent remote working. And some research, this was very late to the game in this talk, Slack also just announced they're going fully remote, if the role permits. So if you have a role at Slack that means that you could successfully do your role from home, then they will offer, you can come to the office if you want to, but there's no need to, there's no obligation for you to do that. So I didn't want to spend too long on sort of the context side of things. So there's obviously a lot more data out there, and I'm limited by time today. But just to recap what we know, the current in-office 9 to 5 was based on a century-old system designed for factory workers and manual labour jobs. We know that. Remote working, whether for better or worse, has been proven to be possible across most office-related positions in the world over the last few months. We know that. Most people would prefer at least some remote working and consider the ability to work from home one of their top reasons for choosing their next position. So that's what we know so far. And with all of those three things combined, the conversations about what are we going to do and are we going to be going to a remote working model, that's a sort of a non-point anymore. We are moving that way. That is the way that things are going to be. So that now we need to look at the different types of remote working and how that's going to affect you guys as recruiters and global recruitment trends. So that's what we'll jump into now. The one thing that came up the most in my research, and the one thing that came up the most when I've been speaking to people on my podcast, for example, was salary. How is salary going to be affected? Now, I've got some great research here to share with you. There's a fantastic article by The Intelligencer that speaks on the subject in reference to Facebook, and I'm quoting here. Mark Zuckerberg says he believes that within 10 years, about half of Facebook's workforce will be working from home permanently. He says the company will adjust pay based on the employee's actual work location. So workers who currently earn the high salaries associated with the high-cost Bay Area may not get to keep them if they move somewhere cheaper. Very, very interesting that he said that. A very interesting model. So Jed Kolko, who's the chief economist at the job listing website Indeed, that we all know, says Facebook's ability to set salaries based on location will be determined by its competitors' preferences and practices. If many other large, prestigious tech firms similarly decide they are prepared to go to a much less office-based culture, and apparently Google is being much more circumspect than Facebook on this subject, for now at least, that could lead to a much more national labour market in the tech industry. So with reduced geographic variation in pay, instead of competing mostly against workers in their local area, workers will compete for jobs all over the country. That makes sense. That's obvious, right? But the question here is, is that going to work? And the interesting point here that I'd like to talk about is, if you're going to pay people by their geographical location, there's got to be some pros and cons and some changes that are going to happen there. I think if Facebook sticks to its guns, continuing to pay salaries relevant to that location, then realistically, as a business owner or from a commercial standpoint, aren't you going to be looking for where you can get the same quality talent but for less of a cost? It doesn't make any commercial sense, in my mind at least, to pay £100,000 for a developer in Palo Alto or London or Berlin when you could have two developers of equal talent and quality overall from anywhere else in the world for the same cost. So with regards to pay and how remote working will affect global recruitment trends, I think it's got to be safe to assume that even if companies guarantee to pay the local fair rate by geography for their employees, the likelihood will be that the locality of that workforce will spread across countries and continents and will ultimately drive salaries down. I think that's an inevitability if we do go to a fully remote workforce. The second point I'd like to talk about is talent pools. Now, look, my background was recruitment. I did recruitment for 10 years. I still do some today. But there was when COVID started and when I sort of went down this looking at remote working journey, all I could keep thinking about was all the times when I was trying to hire some obscure skill that was in an obscure town or a place in the UK that no one had heard of, and there was one person who could do the job and he didn't want to do it or she didn't want to do it, and it just made me think if everyone was remote working, and it was the sort of roles, it was developer roles, and it was roles that now have been seen to be going remote working. If there was that ability back then to have gone across the whole of the UK, the whole of Europe, maybe the whole world, then my talent pool would have gone from one person to potentially 10,000 in the space of a day. And so I think that's, obviously let me preface this by saying there'll be certain roles that will have challenges with remote working. A colleague of mine I spoke to, or acquaintance of mine, I should say, I spoke to, who works in the banking industry, they were talking about how difficult it will be for brokers to get licenses to trade from home and that sort of thing. So there's going to be roles where you do need to have an office, or there's going to have to be law changes around it. So don't get me wrong, I understand that is the case. But for the vast majority of office workers who now can do their roles from home, there's a few different things to discuss in terms of talent pools. So we could discuss the differences across multiple time zones, and there's certainly pros and cons and challenges there. But I think that, again, that's a bit of a non-issue. I used to manage a team in the Philippines and the UK, and the people in the Philippines, they were absolutely fantastic. They would just work UK hours, or they'd work USA hours, and that's a very common thing for them, for people to do over there. So I don't think time zones are going to be a massive issue, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. But let's just talk about the UK to make it simple. So if we talk about the UK, with a fully remote workforce, your talent pool would then become completely unrestricted. It means a different type of talent war, essentially. So where location was restricted to a certain pool, that's going to open up, which is going to be fantastic for diversity. It's going to be fantastic for socially challenged areas. To break it down into the pros and cons, the pros would be there'll be much more diverse talent pool in the pros. Your employees will have a better work-life balance, hopefully, anyway, which should mean increased productivity, a happier team, happier stakeholders, all that good stuff. Unfortunately, there's pros and cons to everything. So the cons are going to be there's going to be a ton more competition for employees. Processes will absolutely need to be streamlined. If you take my example from before, if we're going from a candidate pool of 1 to 10,000, let's be more realistic and say it's 100 to 1,000, for example. That means you're going to have to look at ways of streamlining your process. You're going to have to look at ways of bringing in potentially technology that's going to help you do that. You're going to have to maybe increase the size of your recruitment teams, or find some way to mitigate and deal with that new influx of candidates that are going to be coming through. And I won't get into those details now, but that's going to be one of the consequences of us going into remote working. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about was the type of people that you're going to be hiring. So far we've looked at salary. Salary is going to be affected. We've looked at the talent pools and how they're going to be effective. The other thing is who you're going to hire. Now, I have a great quote here from a senior director in the finance industry, again, someone that I've spoken to recently, and they said this. They said, communication is key here. An employee that can effectively communicate digitally will be much more desirable. And they said, I don't mean, can they get Zoom to work? They said, I mean their ability to structure their day and communicate through digital platforms will make them stand out. Some people thrive in social situations and may not be as good at communicating ideas or being influential or those sort of things. So similar traits over a digital medium as they are in person. And the point was raised during this conversation by someone else that then that gives those people who are better in social situations a disadvantage. I don't agree with that. I think that effective digital communication is going to be a necessary skill that you need to develop. Like people had to develop email skills when emailing was popularized. To be more relevant to today, writing the right sort of LinkedIn post or content for your company, or as an employee to try and find your next position. I think the ability to effectively communicate digitally is now going to be something that recruiters are going to have to be testing for and going to have to be looking for. So as a recruiter, it's going to have to be one of those new skills where you're going to have to not just tell someone how to dress when they're going and make sure they dress smart when they go to the interview, but also how to effectively communicate over digital platforms like Zoom. Talk about lighting, talk about camera angles, those sort of things. It's all going to be new and changed within the recruitment world. So I am doing a roundtable after this, and there's a ton more information I'd like to share with people, but I am limited by time. So let me just get to the conclusions of what I've discussed so far, and then if anyone wants to hop on afterwards, then we can discuss this at more length. So in conclusion, how will remote working affect global recruitment trends? It's going to affect salary. As more companies turn to fully remote workforces, salaries will go down. There was another actually stat from Barclays that the main aspiration for millennials is freedom and flexibility. So if we compound that with the fact that we can now work from home, it's likely going to mean a large population shift, and certainly a geographical talent pool shift, an increase in talent pool size. And it's also going to affect who you hire. So digital communication will be a key asset that will need to be assessed and tested for any remote work. So they're the main three factors that, in my opinion, will be most affected. And the sooner businesses start talking about these challenges that they're going to have to deal with, the further in front of this sort of mass change they get in recruitment trends, the better off they're going to be.